Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us today for this webinar. That's a series sponsored by the College of Education. My name is Frederick No. I'm an assistant professor in the higher education program. And along with my colleagues here, we are just so excited to really have a conversation together and with you that we are titling Changing the Narrative, Using Culturally Responsive Curriculum to Restructure Learning in College Classrooms. I'm actually going to put a little couple questions for you to introduce yourselves in the chat so we can also hear from you. So this is in the Zoom webinar format. There's this chat that everyone can use. There's also a Q&A feature if you have a specific question that you'd like for us to address as we talk. You can also use the raise hand feature, and we will, I'll try to see if there's a good moment for us to respond to your questions. And I would also like to mention this webinar is being recorded for sharing with the broader community at a later date. So if you could please, introduce yourselves in the chat, we'd love to hear from you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited about the questions and the dialogue. A little bit about who I am. When I was thinking about how I wanted to introduce myself, I wanted to introduce myself in a way that it connects to culturally responsive curriculum. So my connection to culturally responsive teaching, I attended, my name is Dr. Norma Marum, an assistant professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning in the Simi area. And I grew up in the Bay Area and I attended San Jose State. So for my K through 12 education, I loved school, but I never really connected to the materials, to a lot of the textbooks. And so it wasn't until I started San Jose State in San Jose State University in California, where I started my undergraduate education. I first joined, became a member of MECHA, which stands for Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, which was founded in 1969. It was a youth conference in Santa Barbara, California, where students across different university campuses adopted El Plan de Santa Barbara, which is a highly politicized student group. Right, I joined because I wanted to make friends, so I wasn't very politicized. And then later I became more aware and conscious of my history that had been intentionally erased throughout my K through 12 education. I also enrolled in ethnic studies courses, including Asian American Studies and Mexican American Studies. Those two courses were the first time where I actually felt connected to the readings, to the assignments, to my professors, right? And when I was thinking about the representation, how important it is to have representation of faculty that look like our students, it's not just the faculty, right? But it's also the representation of staff and leaders. So just to give you some data, according to the Association of American Colleges and Universities, Latina female faculty account for only 3% of tenure or tenure-track faculty. And so we're a small number. And so although I took ethnic studies courses, most of my professors were still male and faculty of color. But the kind of critical care that they took for a lot of my peers and I'll just share a quick example. I'll never forget, I think it was my last year at San Jose State, and I was looking into graduate programs, and I'll never forget that Dr. Baba Yoko, she was the chair of the sociology department, actually took the time to take me out to lunch. Like, can you imagine a department chair takes an undergrad out to lunch and makes sure that, hey, what questions you have about grad school? Like, how can I support you? And so I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Yoko. And I will pass it to Dr. Rincon.
My name is Blanca Rincon. I'm an assistant professor of higher education here at UNLV. I've been here now for 5 years, and I'm excited to be with you all in this conversation today. And I'm going to share an example of culturally responsive teaching. Sorry, I apologize. I'm still getting over a slight cold. From my experience as a student, and well, I didn't really have the language at the time to recognize it as being culturally responsive. The first example that I can think of was actually when I was in high school. I had a math teacher named Miss Kwok, who embodied several elements of being culturally responsive. And I want to talk about 3 of the things that she did that have stayed with me to this day, and I think have really shaped how I see myself as an educator. So one, she had really high expectations of her students. She emphasized community responsibility and developed meaningful relationships with their students. And this is similar to what Dr. Maroon shared about, demonstrating an ethic of care. She was often in her classroom an hour before class started, and students often ate breakfast there. And she got to know us, know about our families, know about our musical taste, because she always played music in class. And if you ever take a class with me, you know that I always ask students what type of music they like to listen to, because I felt like that was one way that she really tried to connect with her students, and something that I think about, and how music embodies so much of the home, and how I want my students to be in a classroom environment that reflects that. And that's like a little thing, but that's one of the things that has stayed with me. The other thing that I mentioned was high expectations. And so I went to a Title I high school in LA where over 90% of the students were Latino and the majority were Mexican American. And I could count the number of teachers who had really, really low expectations of students like me and my peers and our abilities. And she was one of the exceptions. She held us to really, really high expectations, and students would rise to the occasion. She ran an academic decathlon program and would recruit C students, right? And they would place really high because she believed in them, and they believed in themselves because she believed so strongly in how talented we were. And she developed that talent. And she also consistently had students pass the AP Calculus exam, and was eventually awarded a teacher award in the state of California because of just how incredible she was as a math teacher. And then the other thing that I want to emphasize was just like this community responsibility that she instilled within us. We often sat in pods together in the classroom, and she talked about how we had a responsibility for our own learning, but that of our peers as well. And it shaped how we engaged in the classroom. We did a lot of team-based learning and often took exams in pairs where our scores were averaged. And it really made a difference in the classroom environment. Like, we weren't in competition with each other, trying to get the highest grade. We were really focused on making sure that all of us understood the concepts, because when one of us succeeded, we all succeeded. And I think that was just really powerful in just how much she knew her students and like our cultures, and how we were really connected to family, and how she tried to embody that in the ways that she engaged us in the classroom. So I'm really grateful for Mrs. Kwok, and I actually stay in contact with her to this day. And a funny story, but I actually read one of her chapters for her dissertation, because at that point, when she went back to school to get her PhD, I was a faculty member at UConn. So she wanted me to look over one of her chapters. And so it was just really great. And she continues to be someone who I care deeply about, and that I try to emulate in my own teaching. Dr. No.
Thank you. Yeah, real quickly about my background. I had a very similar sort of reflection point as Dr. Maroon. I remember growing up in Long Beach, California, which is the home to the largest Cambodian American population outside of Cambodia, and getting really excited in AP US history that we were sort of getting into the 1970s in our history textbook, because I just like had all these questions about, the history of Cambodian Americans and like the Khmer Rouge genocide and stuff. And I remember being just shocked that there was like literally like a sentence about the US involvement in like Vietnam War and Cambodia. And I was just like, oh, this is strange. I would have thought that the one place in the world where there would be high school curriculum that would help me understand the world that I was living in and my context, it just wasn't there. And then so when I went to college, I actually did major in ethnic studies, and I really appreciated that experience because I got to understand and learn about all these things that had been missing from the curriculum as a youth. So that, that has always given me a respect for this kind of work, and this idea of culturally responsive curriculum and culturally responsive teaching. I also have experience as a K-12 educator. I taught math in high school in Oakland for a number of years, and I think the stakes there for this kind of work felt much more real, like because every day you're going to the class, and if you don't engage your students and you don't help them make connections between the curriculum and their like life context, then it's a bust. Like they're not going to be interested and engaged. And you could tell, like when like the project-based components that had students developing their own questions, considering and reflecting on how the content and the curriculum and the tools that we were trying to teach applied to their lives and applied to their communities in particular. Those lessons and projects were always way more well received. I think my main reflection point from my experience as a K-12 educator with respect to this question is I began to see students as a part of a community and not just like individuals seeking to get a credential, right? Like they were part of this community. They wanted to, we're also training them and equipping them to be leaders and thinkers and like influencers and shapers in their communities. And I think that's an important perspective that I carry with me, even now as I teach for graduate students.
Okay, thank you. So we want to talk a little bit about just, we don't have a lot of time. You can spend a whole semester studying culturally relevant and responsive, and then they're sustaining. So we're only going to talk about relevant and responsive teaching. We just wanted to make sure that we give credit and honor the work of Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings and Dr. Geneva Gay. So a little bit, sometimes they get used interchangeably, and so we want to make sure that that we provide a quick overview and history of the evolution of these theoretical frameworks. So culturally relevant teaching, the way that I see it is it's not a checklist or a program that you can purchase or implement. It really starts with ourselves, right? It's about constantly self-reflection by examining our beliefs, our ideologies, and also how those beliefs influence how you respond to your students, to your professors, to the course material, to the pedagogical practices, right? So for example, right, if when I teach in person, I like to create sort of like a circle and we sit around and we talk, right? And some students are like, why are you doing this? Like we're always used to learning in rows, right? And so sometimes there's pushback, right? And then also to examine your own cultural identity, right? Oftentimes when folks are introduced to these frameworks, they think like, okay, I have to learn other people's culture. Well, you have to also take the time to learn about your own cultural identity, who you are, where you grew up, and how all those life experiences really shape the way that you perceive and walk this world.
And I would add that culturally responsive teaching encompasses everything we do, everything from the content itself and how we teach it, how we cultivate a learning environment, how we interact with students, right? Student to teacher relationships, the policies, whether it's grading policies that you might have, how we assess student learning, whether we grade on a curve, whether we have super high stakes exams, all of that, that is part of, needs to be touched in order to engage culturally responsive teaching. And if we start with the assumption that all curriculum, all instruction, all of the things that we do in the classroom is reflective of a particular cultural viewpoint, then we have to ask ourselves, whose culture is my instruction oriented towards? And I think that's a really good place, similar to what Dr. Maroon said, both what am I doing based on who I am, right? Who I am as a cultural being, but also how does the classroom environment that I've created reflect a particular cultural viewpoint? And is that responsive to the students in my classroom?
Yeah, I'm reminded of that, like the story of the fish swimming in the water. When, you know, another fish passes them by, the fish is like, so how's the water feeling today? And then the fish are like, what water? And like, I think that's a good image for what you just said, Dr. Rincon. Like, we're oftentimes not aware that we are in all kinds of water, right? That water has a certain temperature and taste. And I think it, you know, as I've taught more and more graduate classes, particularly, and I don't often teach classes that directly deal with issues of like race and equity and diversity, but I try to make it a point to have that in all of my classes. It's been important to help students see that all of the research that we read is in a certain type of water, right? It comes out of a certain type of water. So even like I teach economics of higher education, which is a little bit more like quantitative oriented class. I definitely try to take a step back and like explain and have students understand that it is a viewpoint. It's just one viewpoint. It's not the end all be all viewpoint, even though the economists may think that it is. But there's certain assumptions, like Dr. Rincon was saying, that are ingrained in that viewpoint, and it's important to treat it more like one of many viewpoints. And so I do actually, even in that class, introduce some of the critiques of economic perspectives in that. There's one. This might be a good time for one Q&A question that came in. It's, how will knowing culturalism help the students in our classrooms when the building administration is not open to cultural relationships?
I guess for me, I'd need a little bit more information about what's meant by cultural relationships, so that I could respond appropriately.
It may be like when the administration is just not supportive of this, perhaps.
I mean, I think I think what's also important to understand about this work is that it's not easy. You're always going to run into, challenges, and I will, talk a little bit more about that. But just because it's difficult, does that mean we should just not engage in it?
Yeah. And I think just even based, our very first set of responses were all about how our educational experiences were transformed by teachers who did this. And it's not clear if their administration supported it or not, but it's part of the work of transformation.
Yeah, no, I think I'll give an example of that later on. And if that doesn't answer your question, then we can return to it again.
Okay, so the question is, what does culturally responsive and relevant teaching matter in the current socio-political context? And there's a lot I can talk about, but I'm going to try really hard to be brief about this. I think this is really important to understand, right? Because sometimes culture becomes coded language to avoid conversations around race and racism. So understanding the socio-political context under which society, and in particular schools, higher ed, operate under, is really critical in understanding culturally responsive teaching. And I'm going to share a couple of examples, and I can go way back, but I've decided to start with May 2020, when George Floyd was murdered. In the summer of 2020, you saw a growing number of universities writing these statements, even businesses like Old Navy and Ulta were issuing statements condemning systemic racism. And so that summer, right, we were just beginning to grapple with the country's systemic racism. And so we're like, okay, it's real. This is terrible. There's so many injustices. What are we going to do about it? So there seemed to be some momentum, right? And I think we were sort of on the same page. And then 4 months later, on September 4th, 2020, the Trump administration released a memo directing all federal agencies to cease and desist using taxpayer dollars to fund these divisive, quote, divisive un-American propaganda training sessions, including critical race theory. So, and then that late summer also, when schools reopened, we also had growing groups of angry citizens showing up at school board meetings that really felt threatened that their worldviews were not being affirmed in schools, right? That they don't want their children to learn about race and racism. But, all this, it's like we almost forgot what happened to George Floyd, and instead we turned that energy into silencing and erasing the history of marginalized communities. And so I think what's important to understand is that this work is not about replacing one master narrative with another, but rather really helping our students grapple with and think critically through multiple and conflicting perspectives. And so, you have the anti-CRT bans, and then you also have book bans, right? So first they came for CRT, they came for the 1619 Project, and then book bans like Rudy Bridges' biography to the Holocaust-themed novel Mouse. But these book bans are not new. If we look back to the 80s under the Ronald Reagan administration, there was also a huge push towards banning books, films, and classrooms material in the classroom, all in the name of protecting children, students from seeing things that they couldn't handle, right? And so, again, anti-CRT bills across the nation, they really focus on prohibiting teaching materials intended to make students, quote, feel guilt, shame, or discomfort because of their race. And then now in the state of Florida, they recently passed the Don't Say Gay bill, which also blocks teachers from talking about LGBTQ plus issues or people in schools. But what's really interesting about these bans and these what's happening around the country is that most people can't even define CRT, right? Or the fact that it stems from legal studies. And then later, it wasn't until the early 90s when Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, one of the first early scholars in the field of education, to write about CRT at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So, again, I ask you all to think about these policies that are being passed, right? Like, these laws are being passed to prevent discomfort based on an individual's race. And I ask, well, whose discomfort are we prioritizing, right? LGBTQ plus students, transgender students, they don't have a choice to feel discomfort when they hear homophobic language in schools, or when school materials are not relevant or responsive to their lived experiences. So again, these growing campaigns against CRT has really blocked or restricted proactive teaching and professional development related to race, racism, and other isms and other aspects of equity. And we need these frameworks, right, in order to explain racial disparities by examining systems and not. So this work is not about attacking individuals, right? It's really about taking a critical look at these systems that have created these disparities. And so these restrictions, again, they threaten educators from engaging their students in difficult historical facts, current events, and it has really also created a lot of confusion and fear over what teachers can teach, right? And so, and then the other argument is, well, children are too young to learn. Like, what's an appropriate age? And so one thing I always share with my students is, you wouldn't teach a preschooler calculus, but you would start with how to count, right? So material has to be age appropriate, and there's definitely a lot out there. So so that's a little brief overview of the sociopolitical context.
And so we also want to talk about what culturally responsive means under the current sociopolitical context. And so I'm going to start from the bottom and I'll have my colleagues jump in. So some of my work is related to what it means for institutions of higher education to be minority serving. And so as we think about UNLV as a duly designated MSI, as both an ANAPISI and an HSI, and as touting having one of the most racially diverse undergraduate student bodies in the nation, we need to think thoughtfully about what it means to actually serve those students and what it looks like in the classroom to be responsive to their needs as learners. And one of the things that I like to share with folks about minority serving institutions is that there's several designations that exist, and oftentimes we think about historically Black colleges and universities, or even tribal colleges and universities that are mission-based, right? They were often created by and for the communities that they were created to serve. And that's not true for Asian American, Native Pacific Islander serving institution and Hispanic serving institutions that were birthed out of predominantly white institutions, right? So they became minority serving after the fact when they reached a particular enrollment threshold. And many of these predominantly white institutions are modeled after colonial colleges or historically white colleges and universities that excluded students of color and that were built to largely serve a white and male student body. So when we look at how we teach in the college setting, we need to look at how Eurocentric values, beliefs, and practices are embedded in the ways we teach, because it's not just how we do higher education, but then how we are trained within those institutions and then come to places like UNLV that are very different. And so there is an unlearning that needs to occur to be culturally responsive. And I think to piggyback on something that Dr. No said, I think that the stakes are higher here, right? Because of who we are and who we serve. And I think that it requires a deep introspection of why we do things the way that we do and who it's working for and who it's not working for and how do we change it so that we do better.
Yeah, thank you. For this question, Dr. Maroon already talked about it a little bit, but there's been some really fascinating research in higher education by higher ed scholars looking at institutional responses to racism and essentially highlighting how they are these non-performatives that really, they say things but really absolve the university from actually doing anything, right? So they say things just for the talk, but they're not really leading to action. So I think it's important to recognize, I think that this falls under this idea of being culturally responsive. I happen to actually be engaged in this research project on students enrolled in English for Speakers of Other Languages programs, so like English language learners in the community college setting. And we were mainly looking at advising and their sort of connection to the institution. But as we were doing our interviews, all of these incidents of anti-Asian hate and violence were sort of present, right, in the media. And so a lot of these students who were Asian immigrants began to talk about this because it was so worrisome and scary for them. And I think the point that I wanted to make was, I think for some students, such as these Asian immigrants that I was working with, this is like the college or the university is like the main point of connection to like a social institution in their lives, right? And the community college in particular, like they were getting, in addition to like financial support and direct being provided support for to different resources for like food and just mental health, community resources. Like the community college was that place. And so it was actually very affirming and supportive that their instructors took time and space in the classroom to talk about this, to direct them to, mental health resources, counseling, took the time to listen to their fears and concerns about these particular issues. So I think just in my own research, I've seen the power of being responsive to students' needs.
Thank you. I guess for me, what's really important about culture responsive teaching is that it cannot be done in one course. So I think we all need to do this collectively as a college, as a university. And, just because you're uncomfortable and you don't know where to start, just because we're faculty of color doesn't mean we're born knowing this stuff. So we also had to spend time reading and thinking and writing about this. And so what I think it's, again, the being able to do this work collectively, right? And so I've been teaching, this is my 6th year, and I've been teaching the multicultural education course. And just recently, I was really surprised because I usually assigned Kimberly Crenshaw, I think around the 3rd week, on intersectionality. And this was the first time a student said, "Oh, I have already read that in another class." And I was, I wanted to jump up, with joy, because that's what I want to hear. I want students to say, "Oh yeah, we've talked about it in my literacy class or in my science class or in my higher ed class," right? Where, again, the burden doesn't just fall on one course or one faculty, because it's not sustainable, right? And especially if this information is being presented by a faculty of color, it's often perceived as bias or inaccurate, right? And so I think if our students can hear this multiple times, I think the message will be loud and clear.
So we want to really end today with talking about moments in our teaching that led us to incorporate more culturally responsive practices. And I'll go ahead and share 2 examples. And I think this one relates to one of the questions that was asked. So early on in my career, so I'm in higher education, and I teach a lot of the college student courses. So early on in my career, I find myself teaching a college student development course. And when I was preparing to teach it for the first time, I received a syllabus from a colleague, and I met with her to talk to her about how I should approach teaching the class. And, she's like, I always use the green textbook, and, it's a foundation to preparing higher education and student affairs administrators. And even though I had taken that class in my own graduate career and had found that most of the theories that we were being taught were based on a predominantly white male student body, I taught that course in that way. I used the green textbook, even though I knew that there were so many problems with the theories, I felt a lot of pressure from my colleagues and from the field at large. Also served in a leadership position for ACPA, which is our professional organization that, and in that capacity, I helped faculty who taught in higher ed and student affairs programs, and I collected a bunch of syllabi and to share, right? We had these community sourcing, and every single one of those syllabi taught that course in the same way. They exposed students to the same theories. And so I didn't feel like I could deviate from that. You know, I had to teach my students about cognitive and moral development. I had to teach my students in this way. And even though we critiqued those theories in the classroom, I still felt like I was doing them a disservice because that's not who our college students are today. Even if I was at UConn, which is largely white, the students in our higher ed program were not, and they would go on to work at other institutions that also were not. But it wasn't actually until I came here to UNLV that I completely shifted the way that I approached teaching that class. And I think a lot of it came from my students and how they very much wanted to do better by our students. They wanted to enact change. They saw some of the challenges in doing things the way that they are done and wanted to do differently. And so that really gave me, I think, the permission I needed to deviate from that, even though I still felt like I had voices telling me that I somehow wasn't preparing my students to know the foundational theories in the field. I knew that the students here at UNLV largely stayed here, and I wasn't teaching them about, you know, theories about how students learn and grow in college that stemmed from culturally diverse groups that were based on research that included these students and that were based by faculty who also reflected those experiences, right? So like validation theory, culturally engaging campus environments, racial identity development theories, all of that, while I touched on them, now became central to how I approached teaching that course. And so I think that it took me some time, but I think coming here really and meeting my students and really learning about what they wanted to do and the type of change that they believe was necessary gave me the permission to go against the larger field. And now there's change in the field where people are pushing back and there's alternative textbooks. But when I started here in 2017, that wasn't the case. This has been really recent within the last year or two. So that's one example. And I think that speaks to some of the elements of the first question that was shared. I think the second example, and I'll stop. I'll allow my colleagues, because I know we're at the 39-minute mark. And then if we have more time, I can share.
Yeah, I think related to that as well, I think at a bare minimum, like, you know, I review my syllabi, look for the authors that are being included and who's excluded. I think faculty can have a tendency to want to just have their syllabi and just go back to it every year for 10 years. But the professoriate and the, you know, scholarship is changing, and it's important to stay on top of who is producing new thought and who are those people, right? And so I try to update my syllabus, particularly with scholars and researchers of color who bring different perspectives and important and valuable perspectives to whatever classes I'm teaching. Like that, like the bare minimum there. I think that, at least, and this is also drawing from my K-12 experience, a lot of it is like encouraging and validating students in bringing their own questions and ideas to the table, like helping them to ask their own questions and guiding them in the formulation process of those questions, because those questions are often connected to their experience, and that their experience is a part of their community and culture. And so I think it can shut people down if you see yourself as the expert and like, this is the way that things are going to happen, and I'm socializing you into this certain environment and culture. Like it's being open to change and being inviting like the pushback against the status quo, essentially. So I think, you know, I try to do that. I try to like honor the students' like lines of inquiry, particularly as we're training researchers, you know, in the master's and PhD program. Like try not to just shut down things that are different, right? I think that's an important thing that I do for now.
Thank you. For me, I just want to share 3 examples. One, when I first started teaching at UNLV, I was really excited, right? Because I had spent a lot of time at historically white institutions. And so, you know, I was excited to work at a Hispanic serving, minority serving institution. And also like looking at our school district, right? Almost 50% of our CCSD students identify as Latinx. And so one of the first things I did was create a course titled Teaching About Latino Experiences in Education. And I was really excited, right, to offer a class because there had never been a class offered on just looking, instead of just spending 1 week looking at Latinos, we were spending the entire semester looking at the history and current how the education of Latinos has evolved over time. And, you know, and every semester I teach, I struggle to get enrollments because I often get, oh, well, it's not required, so why should I take it, right? Well, even if it's not required, it's important because look at, we're an HSI. If you're going to be a teacher, you're going to be teaching predominantly Latinx students, right? And to that, like, we don't have an African Americans or an Asian American experience in education, right? And so I think there's definitely more room. Second, I would just encourage all of you to consistently self-reflect on your beliefs and ideologies and how your identities impact your teaching practice. And then lastly, I just kind of want to end with a quote from the CRT scholar Derek Bell. Quote, he says, just because something is impossible doesn't mean it's not worth struggling against. So I think that's just such a powerful quote, right? That this work is difficult, but for me, it's worth struggling. It's worth the struggle.
Thank you, Dr. Maroon. So now we'll go ahead and go to the Q&A portion of the talk.
Yeah, so feel free to type any questions you'd like answered. I see one already. It's, how do you suggest culturally inclusive teaching be incorporated into engineering and science curricula? I do believe we have an expert on that. So I don't, Dr. Rincon, you want to take that one?
So I can talk a little bit about this because I think, you know, right now I'm co-facilitating the Culturally Relevant and Responsive Teaching Fellows Program. And currently we're working in the College of Engineering, but we're going to be including the rest of STEM within the next 2 years. And so one of the biggest challenges that I've encountered in engaging in that work and bringing in experts from the College of Education to share with our College of Engineering faculty is that oftentimes, faculty and graduate students also, folks want to know, like, what can I do? Tell me what to do and I'll do it, right? And I get, right, like you go to problem solving, just, you know, I want to check the box. Tell me, you know, work in small groups, got it, you know, and like I understand where that's coming from. But I think one of the things that folks have a hard time with early on in this fellowship experience is that we do a lot of, or maybe not a lot of, we try to incorporate introspective work, so reflection, understanding biases that we bring into the classroom, understanding our own cultural beliefs and where they stem from, and what it means for how we do things in the classroom. And so folks folks are like, I don't get why we're like, how, like, I'm not going to have students facilitate conversations around race. I'm like, that's not for students, that's for you, right? Like, you need to do some unlearning and really some recognition of things that we bring into the classroom that will impact the delivery of any type of culturally responsive or relevant practice, right? Like, you can have all the tools at your disposal, but if you still believe these deficit views, if you still come in the classroom with deficit views, I can give you any tool you want. These scholars can give you any tool you want. You're still going to not be effective, right? Because it requires you to really think about who you are. What do you believe about students and their abilities and their families, and who they are, right, as cultural beings, that then shapes the things that we do in the classroom. And so there are a lot of examples of folks in engineering and in the sciences who are very successful at incorporating culturally responsive teaching practices. And I can point you to some if you email me, because we currently have a huge resource that we're compiling as part of this research project. But I guess what I'll start with is there's a little bit of self-work that needs to be done before you start using any of the tools that we could, list out for you, because nothing that you take up will be effective, or maybe you might have some success, right? But it won't be as effective if you still believe these problematic things about students. And I'm not saying you do, but I think that oftentimes I hear a lot of things about how our students can or cannot do things within the sciences. And so that's what I will suggest. And other folks can jump in.
I would just say, take one of our classes. That's a start, right? I've had students in chemistry and other fields take the class and have found, things that they could apply to their own field. And so, I think that's part of putting in the work, right? Like, take the class, do the reading, have these conversations, the reflection. But I would say take one of our classes.
And I think I'll add one more thing here, because I'm not an engineering faculty, right? So I think some of it requires you to make that applicable for you in the work that you do. So yeah, take the class and see how you might do things within engineering where the science is different.
Any other questions? You can also talk if you raise your hand. Young Bach, the administrator, can unmute you. Maybe Dr. Rincon, can I probe a little bit about your research? I know you've written a lot about like this idea of family in STEM in particular, and how that supports students.
Yeah.
About that.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about the work I've done around academic family. And so a lot of the students that I had the privilege of learning from within my research have shared how they recreate family within the college setting to be successful. And they do this through a variety of ways, but really they identify people, whether it's staff, faculty, peers, that reflect some of those cultural attributes of the home. And this goes beyond, race, ethnicity. That's important. And oftentimes that is one of the factors, but it's not the only factor. And so they recreate these little families within, cultural centers, within minority serving programs, such as, LSAMP or RSOs, such as SHIP, or NSBE, and they they push against some of the practices that typically are found within colleges of engineering and colleges of science, where they're supposed to work individually, and they work together. And oftentimes these students find themselves in classrooms where they're afraid to raise their hand and ask questions because they're often one of the only students of color in the classroom. And so they use these academic families to ask those questions, and ask those questions in an environment that's safe, where them asking a question about something they don't understand isn't seen as reflecting every brown or Black student within engineering or the sciences. So I think it's just really powerful the way that students destigmatize not knowing and failure, and how they create these communities of care and communal responsibility, right? They take care of each other both academically and then in other ways, right? Whether it's, they ran out of swipes at the dining hall, they'll swipe, their peer in. And and staff and faculty will go above and beyond what they're required to do to make sure that these students are successful, providing them supports. There's one student who talks about how, I can go to this person for anything. They're like a mother to me. And so oftentimes these students will talk about these staff, these faculty, these peers as members of their family. And they'll be like, oh, that's my sibling, that's my academic sibling, that's my academic auntie, or whatever. And so it's just really powerful how students are creating these support systems that help them be successful in spaces where they typically aren't, and that they're changing the institution in a lot of important ways. And so we could learn a lot from them, to think about how we do things differently in our classroom. And I had shared as we were preparing for this, I had shared with Dr. Maroon and Dr. No, so we were talking about gotten COVID and how students had to miss class. And so Dr. Maroon had asked, well, what happens to those students if they miss class? And I asked them not to come because I'm in person, but we do community note taking, right? So as a class, we take notes together. And so we share those notes with each other, because that's how we try to create that community in our classroom so that we can be there for each other, right? And there's all these other things that I do in my classroom to try to do that, and to not just to be culturally responsive, but also to prepare them to work in higher education. You never work by yourself in higher education. So you have to learn to be in community with others and work with others, even if they're different from you, even if they do things differently than you would have done. So I think I've talked a lot, but that's what I would share about some of my work and how it's shaped the things that I do in my classroom.
Well, I think we're coming up on time, so I think there's no other questions. Thank you all for coming. You can feel free to email. I think you can feel free to email us with any follow-up or questions you may have. I want to thank College of Ed for hosting this, and also particularly Young Bach for getting our tech all set up and helping it to run smoothly. Any last words of wisdom in her view?
I just want to thank everyone for coming, and I look forward to continuing these conversations.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Don't give up on the work.